deep analysis. We are joined by researcher Dr. Remi Piet, live from Paris. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Asia One. So, Dr. Piet, the US has now carried out a 13th consecutive night of strikes inside Iran. So, from a political economy perspective, how sustainable is the prolonged military campaign for both Washington and Tehran?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a very interesting question indeed, because when you're looking at from a political economy standpoint, there are some capacities both from Washington and Tehran to continue that conflict. The one that will strongly suffer are the Gulf countries neighboring the conflict. Washington has the capacities to continue, obviously the bombing for quite a certain amount of weeks. There were some concerns on the stocks of missiles, but which since they actually disengaged from the Ukrainian conflict, there are some capacities to still continue producing Patriot missiles and others into Iran. Donald Trump is asking for additional budget to Congress and could actually go through executive decree to ask for additional budget, so that there is a capacity to continue that conflict onto that front. On the Tehran side, obviously, the economy of Tehran, of Iran, has been strongly suffering from international sanctions. The marginal impact of those strikes is actually quite limited. Iran is able to source its basic needs in agricultural goods and others from its own country. So it doesn't really impact the capacity of resilience from Tehran. The main concerns are for Iraq, Qatar, Kuwait, other countries that use the Strait of Hormuz for exports of petroleum products that are extremely impacted by this incapacity to export their production, and indirectly also Asian countries and somewhat lower sense European countries that are the main purchasers of this natural gas and petroleum exports from Gulf countries.
And President Trump has suggested that seized Iranian assets could be used to compensate losses caused by Red Sea shipping disruptions. So what legal and economic implications could such move, do you think, have for the international financial system?
I believe it's more political rhetoric from the Trump administration trying to limit its impact on the American people view on the conflict. There's limited Iranian assets in the hands of the US. There are definitely some financial capacities and seized financial assets in the UAE, in Qatar, and others. They pledged to return those funds to Iran as part of the protocol. So it's quite limited the capacity of financing through seized Iranian assets, unless the Trump administration is discussing the capacity to seize islands such as the island of Krag or others in the Hormuz Strait, but that would actually create in the Persian Gulf, but that will create further escalation of the conflict. When you're looking really in terms of the capacity to sustain the effort of war, as I said, there is capacity to move forward, but it will not be based on the seizings of Iranian assets to finance for that conflict.
And so continued attacks around the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea are creating uncertainty for, obviously, global trade. So which sectors and economies are the most vulnerable if this crisis continues?
Obviously, the energy sector with the exports from GCC countries, especially Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain to a lesser extent. But this has a more general, larger impact on all industrial activities, because the price of energy is strongly impacted by this conflict. You also start having a potential secondary front on the Red Sea exports, or at least this trade between Djibouti, Yemen, and Somalia. This would strongly impact the capacity for other manufactured goods to actually be able to service European markets. So it's not a specific sector in itself, apart from obviously the energy sector. It is the widespread economy that is impacted by energy prices. This will actually have very strong strain on already ailing global growth, and this will severely impact especially Asian economies that are have limited other source of imports of energy. A lesser amount of impact will be felt by the European countries that usually now actually sources the LNG from the Americans, and so the US actually might strongly benefit from that conflict in the long run.
And Europe remains heavily exposed to energy price volatility. So how concerned should European governments be about another prolonged Middle East conflict and that it's going to affect inflation and economic recovery?
Absolutely. I mean, European government is already very, very concerned into that front, trying to lessen this impact and negotiating together with GCC countries a decreasing of the conflict itself. The impact on inflation, the impact on the capacity of industrial apparatus to continue producing at a decent price is extremely high. Some countries will be impacted more than others. I mean, France is able to rely, for example, on a strong nuclear power. Others, such as Denmark or Germany, have some level of renewable energy that they can actually rely on. But a lot of the industry is much more focused on LNG and oil imports from different countries, and these will be strongly impacted. And as I said, other alternative for imports of LNG is usually coming from the Gulf of Mexico and imports from the US. As in the long run, the American economy might actually benefit from this. This might actually explain a lot of the reasons why Donald Trump is continuing that conflict, is because the one will be paying the cost of it are not the US. It is Asian economies, to a lesser extent, European economies, and definitely GCC countries.
And so with diplomacy appearing to be stalled and military pressure increasing, so what combination of economic incentives or international mediation do you think could realistically bring both Washington and Tehran back to negotiations?
In terms of international pressure, and you mentioned international law, another one of your questions. Unfortunately, Donald Trump doesn't really, focus on these. There is definitely some pressure in trying to get everyone around the negotiation table. But the only strong impact might actually be coming from domestic elections and the midterm elections in the later this year, unless Donald Trump has already calculated the fact that he will lose those elections. But we're seeing potentially a very large wave of Democratic votes, both in Congress and in the Senate. If the Trump administration loses both houses of Congress, this might have very strong impact on the capacity of the Trump administration to continue that conflict. There are requests at the U.S. Congress to have to go through U.S. Congress to validate, further conflict as per the legal terms. Our American president can actually, pursue an international conflict. But Donald Trump has already mentioned the fact that he will not, abide by these. So we're looking at a much more authoritarianism turn into the U.S., not actually, respecting counterpower and moving forward in a conflict that is definitely not in the best interest of the American citizen.
Many thanks,